this panel, we're going to investigate historic designation. Lake Park is on the National Historic Register, and we are lucky to have Ann Hamilton, who's president of Lake Park Friends, who will be able to talk about that. You heard yesterday some considerable discussion about having Washington Park on the National Historic Register, and also that the entire park system was potentially eligible for listing on the National Historic Register. I think this is something that many of us would like to see happen. But it's also fair to say that there are those who are very concerned about historic designation, that it's restrictive, that it poses problems. And so what we wanted to do today was really talk a little bit about that. I also wanted to follow up just briefly on Larry Cotton's discussion about next year's meeting. For those of you who were at dinner last night, we did announce through our quiz that we will be going to Downing Park, the last great work of Olmsted and Vaux and their sons, in September of 2024. You can pencil in the 16th through the 20th now, and we will finalize the details. But we will be going there. Next year is the birthday of Calvert Vaux, and so we thought that would also be particularly appropriate. But I will pledge to you now that, yes, we will do something with Hudson River Valley painters, and we will have a great expert on Calvert Vaux, the greatest expert on Calvert Vaux, speaking to us there, and we're just beginning to make plans for that. But it should be a very exciting opportunity to see, again, a beautiful, beautiful park that is challenged in many ways, but is also seeing a great deal of new energy. So with that, let me turn this over to Jennifer Current, who comes to us from Quorum Architects. They have had wonderful representation at this meeting. And Jennifer is a landscape architect, and she will be conducting this panel. JoAnn Beck, who comes from Highland Park Conservancy in Rochester, a landscape architect and marvelous human being whose conservancy is just fantastic. If you haven't been to the Rochester parks, you've got to go do it. Wynnie-Fred Victor Hinds from Weequahic in Newark. We're delighted to have her here as well, and we'll have to find a way to get to your park too. So with that, Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the National Park Service as a quick introduction. The National Park Service defines a cultural landscape as a geographic area, including both cultural and natural resources, and the wildlife or domestic animals therein, associated with a historic event, activity, or person, or exhibiting other cultural or aesthetic values. There's a lot of other definitions of cultural landscapes also. UNESCO says that these are combined works of nature and of man that illustrate successive social, economic, and cultural forces. And the Cultural Landscape Foundation says cultural landscapes provide a sense of place and identity. They map our relationship with the land over time. So in the writing of the National Historic Preservation Act, the National Park Service states that historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people. The preservation of this irreplaceable heritage is in public interest so that the vital legacy of cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits will be maintained and enriched for future generations of Americans. And so designed landscapes, like those that we're here to discuss together, Olmsted design landscapes in particular, these are just one type of cultural landscape. And if we consider Olmsted landscapes, we consider the functional, aesthetic, social understanding. This really largely influences the making of the American city and the understanding of nature in the city as we understand it today. And we see that the reach is far beyond parkland. We know that the National Park Service, which oversees these historic designations, reports that there are over 130 listings of Olmsted properties on the National Historic Register. 5 of those are National Historic Landmarks, and we know that in Wisconsin we have 2, Riverbend in Kohler and Lake Park, which we'll hear about today. So I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with these panelists. I think that they can share with us these success stories of how designated and protected cultural landscapes can function in the contemporary American city. And so I'd like to just say welcome to all of you and ask each of you to tell us about the park or the park system that you represent and the kind of historic designation of that and why that matters.
Hi. In Rochester, we thank you, Virginia, for that wonderful history yesterday, because Rochester's history, just substitute Rochester for Milwaukee, and you have the outline and history of our park system, which is 3 parks, just like Milwaukee, developed by Frederick Olmsted Sr. and the same time period. They must have been very, very busy. And I always tell, in my tours, the group that our park system is sort of like a rare and endangered species, because there's only a handful of park systems by Olmsted. It's a very rare occurrence. So our park system has 3 parks. Highland Park, I'm president of Highland Park Conservancy, and Highland Park is situated on the glacial moraine in Rochester. It's the smallest, it was the first, it's the most intact, and it's the jewel of the system. It's an arboretum that is populated with collections of ornamentals, completely different from the current opposite from the current trend toward natives. But Highland Park it's a tourist attraction. Every year it attracts hundreds of thousands of people to the annual Lilac Festival. And it has been designated on the National Register since 1977 as a contributing property to a National Register district. And that has been valuable in raising funds from public funds, because in our grant proposals, designated properties get extra points, and every extra point helps. So the one big loss that Highland Park, really the major loss of integrity to Highland Park, was the demolition of the Children's Pavilion, which is 3-story open-air pavilion at the high point of the park, which was to provide, as I'm probably going to mess up this quote, but shade, shelter, prospect, the view, and comfort. That was the locus of that, of those qualities in Highland Park. It was demolished in 1963, you know, the nadir of the public park systems all across the country. And Highland Park Conservancy has been working for decades to make the case that it needs to be rebuilt in the same style, designed by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, in the same style, the same scale, the same location, to save the same purpose. And the designation helped us to lobby and get the public funding, the portion of the public funding that we needed to succeed. And so that key structure is due to be rebuilt next year. The funny thing about the National Register designation of Highland Park is that there is no content to it. It is not based on the Olmsted design. The name Olmsted is never mentioned, because in 1977, there was no vocabulary, there was no national standard for describing the values of landscape. That was established by the National Park Service in the Guidelines for the Treatment of Cultural Landscapes, a great contribution to our heritage. Okay. The other park that I need to mention is Seneca Park, which is our picturesque park, 3 miles long on the rugged Genesee River Gorge. Both sides of the gorge has a 60-foot waterfall, native forest with ecotones that you can trace toward the lake. And unlike Washington Park, it has a zoo, which I refer to as the damn zoo. And unlike Washington Park, where people figured out that the zoo was outgrowing its space, they never did in Rochester, and it has been expanding and at the expense of the historic landscape. And at one point, there was a plan that actually obliterated the historic landscape on that one side of the river. And fortunately, we had a master plan provided by the dream team of Patricia O'Donnell and Charlie Beveridge, which was the best documentation and ammunition for preservation that you could ask for. And in response to this plan, there was open conflict in our community. We had lawn signs, we had T-shirts, we had press conferences, and we sponsored an application to the National Register to put the park on the National Register. We also sponsored an application to do a local landmark status, which happened, but there were lawsuits, and the lawsuits were lost, and so the actual protection that local designation would provide was ineffective. But we do have a National Register designation for Seneca Park. All of it, both sides. And that has actually been very beneficial in drawing a line. It didn't prevent the zoo from expanding. It didn't stop the zoo. It drew a line that protected the most valuable parts of the park. It hasn't been perfect. I go to Seneca Park and I see the zoo. It gives me heartburn. No rapture, nothing like what you do see in the historic landscape. Heartburn, but it stopped, and we can thank the really strong content of that designation for providing a rational discussion in the community of what is valuable and what needs to be preserved and what can happen where. And I have more to say about that, but that's enough for now.
What's the third park?
Oh, yes. The third park is Genesee Valley Park, and that's our pastoral park. The largest park, it's at the junction of the Genesee River in a very calm, broad, beautiful section, and the Erie Canal. So it's 4 segments all around that intersection. It's a glorious park, absolutely well used at every level. It's a nexus of statewide trail systems. Very, very important park. But there is no designation. I mean, it's eligible for designation. There is no friends group, and it has had the most incremental damage of any of the 3.
What is the name again?
Genesee Valley Park.
Genesee Valley Park.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I'm learning more and more every day. And now I'm going to talk about Weequahic Park and also mention a little bit about Branchbrook Park, which are the 2 Olmsted parks in Newark. And I'm the executive director of the Weequahic Park Association. As we locals call it, Weequahic, even though it sounds as if it should be pronounced Weequahic, right? Or Weequahic, which means head of the cove in Lenni Lenape. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my association, or our association, Weequahic Park Association. And it's a grassroots 501c3 organization which was founded in 1992 and established as a 501c3 in 1993. And it's an interesting story because it was founded by a group of runners. So all community residents, because of the deterioration of the park, which was really neglected. And as Mr. McNeil, the co-founder, who's 92 years old and who's still involved, every once in a while when I go to the office, he tries to be there. And, he's my mentor and a wonderful book of knowledge. And so as he said, even the squirrels didn't want to hang out at the park. And so they took it upon themselves, to fix the park. And in '95, they went into a partnership agreement with the county because it's a county park and not a city park. And they modeled themselves after Central Park, which is where it ends. Okay, that's it. After that, nothing else, basically. Because where we're at, we're in the southern part of Newark, which is a really underserved, overpolluted neighborhood. And we're next to the airport. We're also next to the port. And last count, like between 4,000 to 10,000 diesel spewing trucks pass by Freelinghausen, which buttresses the park every day. So mind you all of that. And also it's been said 1 out of 3 to 1 out of 4 children suffer from asthma. And you have a whole slew of other problems: cancer, lung disease, metabolic syndrome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've not only had to take it upon ourselves to preserve and help restore the park, but also other social issues. And even though you do have other organizations, but still, sometimes it's not enough. And so right now we're focusing, under my leadership, we're focusing a lot more on park issues. And one of the questions that the residents usually ask me when they find out that I'm the executive director of the park is, do you work just with the park, or do you also work throughout the city? Because to them, it would be a sin, it seems like, if you only worked for the park. It comes off as elitist. And so you also have to work outside of the park. And Branch Brook, which is the other park situated in the northern part of the city, is the beautiful sister out of the parks, and has all these cherry blossom trees, more so than in Washington, D.C. And so they have these beautiful cherry blossom festival like every April and May. And so they're better funded than we are. They have better relationship with the county, not as adversarial as we are with the county. And, just nicer things, basically, than we do. But we don't begrudge them, not at all. We're not petty at all. Gritty, yes. Resentful at times, yes, maybe. But still, we try to support them. Unfortunately, the county tries to create this divide between us. And so even when they gave tours of the city, of the different parks, they never came over to Weequahic Park. So it was usually relegated to, the Tonier side of town, and rarely went over to Weequahic Park. And but we have a whole slew of accomplishments, and we have them documented. It's not just by word, through articles, writings, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, the county had been trying to erase that history. And Mr. McNeil, who is older. He's on with age, and a lot of the other founders, they've passed on, or they can no longer do it. And so he asked me to take on the role as executive director. And so I said, no, this has got to stop. You cannot erase the history of what these wonderful people did. And so they started in '96 by tearing down one of the Olmsted grandstands, the stadium that they tore down. And even one of the city council people, funny enough, who was born in Detroit, and she put herself between the bulldozer and the stadium, but that didn't help. And so that's when Weequahic Park Association, and this was before my time, they started talking about designating the park as a historic park. But it didn't really go anywhere because it was always some opposition, always some scandal with another representative, doing some behind the scene deal, et cetera, et cetera. And then around 2003, when around the time that I arrived in Newark, like half a block away from the park, and one of the reasons that we bought the house was because of the park, because we just fell in love with the park. And unbeknownst to me, right, that I would be the executive director now. And so they started talking about historic designation for the whole neighborhood. And so there weren't really a lot of community input. And the input that I heard was, well, they're going to come in and they're going to make this a historic area. That means I won't be able to paint my house the way I want to. I won't be able to do anything with my house the way I want to. So a lot of people didn't see the value in making it a historic district. And at the time, I was just happy. I was like, oh, okay, our property value is going to go up. Okay, yippee. And so the fight continued, and lo and behold, it became a state designated historic. I'm not sure if it's national because I haven't seen that, but probably is. But I haven't seen the papers, but definitely with the application for the state registry. And so little by little, okay. So little by little, we struggled, and then we fought for whatever we could get for Weequahic Park. And the building where our offices was located was knocked down. And unfortunately, it had a plaque dedicated to the grandmothers who also joined the fight, because there were a group of grandmothers who did the blueprint. They worked with the architects to draw up the plan for the building, because the original Olmsted field house, they had knocked it down. The boathouse, they knocked it down. And so even though we had gotten architects to do an assessment and say that the buildings are perfectly sound, they didn't listen, and they went ahead and they knocked them down anyway. And so they knocked down the most recent building that was built by, the grandmothers and the other architects. And so, again, another erasure of the history. And so they put in its place, it looks lovely, and, one-story community center. But prior to that, ours was a 2-story building. And so now they diminished it to a 1-story. And they have seniors come in. And after visiting Washington Park's senior center, it put ours to shame, unfortunately. And basically, they have the seniors in the room, and they come in 9 o'clock in the morning, and they'll have breakfast, play bingo and, dominoes, whatever, and then they'll have lunch. And then again, bingo, dominoes, and at 2 o'clock, they go home. And after that, that's it. It remains empty except for another organization that the county put in order to push us out. So they tried to push us out by putting in another organization that has nothing to do with Olmsted, who at the beginning didn't even know who Olmsted was. And one of them at one point told me, well, I was born here, I grew up here, and I never heard of Olmsted, and I never heard, of the Weequahic Park Association. And I told her, I said, well, that's because of your own ignorance, don't blame. But I'll stop here because time's up.
Good morning. Lake Park Friends has been on Lake Park has been on the National Historic Register since 1993. It was when it was about 100 years old that it went on the register. There were two private citizens, Virginia Palmer and Lynn Goldstein, who prepared the application for its inclusion, and it was approved a year later. In the application, which includes a wonderfully detailed history of Lake Park, the authors cite Olmsted's contributions and the fact that the appearance of Lake Park closely resembled the plan for the park, which had been prepared by the Olmsted firm in 1895. The second major reason for requesting National Historic designation was the Indian Mound in Lake Park, which of course is a whole lot older than Lake Park. Citing the work of Increase Lapham, the authors note that the size and shape of the Lake Park mound suggests a Middle Woodland origin, so perhaps dating back as far as 300 BC. But there was some uncertainty about the actual dating at that time. They noted it's intact. There had been other mounds here before the park was built, but that were destroyed. But this mound is intact. Its location is considered unusual because usually, as according to this report, they would be closer to, say, riverbeds and not as close to the lake. But so the fact that there was both this intact Indian mound and the closeness of Lake Park, the adherence to Olmsted's original design, meant that it was approved on the National Historic Register in 1993. I think that what's really interesting here is that the application predates the centennial celebration in the park in 1994, and it also predates but inspires the establishment of Lake Park Friends. It also informed the mission statement of Lake Park Friends, in which historic preservation is key. The mission statement reads, it is to promote the preservation and enjoyment of Lake Park, to sponsor educational, recreational, and cultural events in the park, and to raise funds for the restoration and enhancement of the park in the spirit of Frederick Law Olmsted. So he's actually right in our mission statement. Now note, it does say in the spirit of, it doesn't say exactly according to everything that Olmsted would have done, which of course we can't always predict. But I think that's really important because our mission guides absolutely everything that we do. So we're always turning to historic preservation. Even just a quick story. I don't know how many of you remember, or especially if you're from out of town, you might not have been aware, but there was a huge Pokemon controversy here in 2016, where Lake Park was absolutely jam-packed with people. My son couldn't run through the park because it was just, everybody was on their phones looking for the various Pokemon sightings. I don't do this, so I don't really understand it. But the park was incredibly crowded, and the neighbors got very upset about it. There was no parking because the park was filled with people playing with their Pokemon and with their heads in their phones. But Lake Park Friends took a very controversial position at the time. We argued that they had to be allowed to stay because it was an access issue. And Frederick Law Olmsted, built the park for all people. And he didn't really say what people had to be doing when they were in the park, So, and then it went away eventually. There was a proposed ordinance, and the company, I don't know all the details, but it sort of struck me that also goes back to our mission, and the mission relates to the ideas of Frederick Law Olmsted. So even though keeping Pokemon in the park doesn't seem to have anything to do with historic preservation, it's an example of how we continually go back to to the ideas of Frederick Law Olmsted. We're involved. I was just looking at the photos here, which I think are wonderful. They're historic photos. And prior to historic designation, there were some wonderful structures in the park, and some of them are gone. For example, the stadium, which was right off of the grand staircase, and the streetcar depot. Of course, we have updated our playground from the one that's there, which of course would have to happen given legal requirements. But so there are things that have been changed in Lake Park. Not a whole lot, I would argue, since we got the historic designation. And of course, the historic designation was key to saving the concrete bridge, which is just around the corner here. And right now, we're involved in a very large controversy with the county over the road underneath. So Lake Park Friends in 2019 adopted a resolution arguing that because the road is part of Olmsted's original plan and because it was designed according to Olmsted for pleasure driving, and because it's the only road that currently goes through the park, our position is that we would like that road to open up to cars again. We are having a tough fight in front of us right now. We are taking it to the Historic Preservation Commission. And when I was asked to be on this panel and I read the questions, what does historic preservation mean to you in the park? I thought we're about to find out. Because the Historic Preservation Commission, we have indications that they fully support our position, but it easily could be overturned by the Common Council. And they're talking about putting several lanes down the road, one for bikes, one for people, one for... Some have even argued that perhaps we should have a concession here. This is at one of the public meetings. Have a concession here where the county would rent out golf carts and take people on little excursions down the road. And then we would be fulfilling Olmsted's mission of having it be a pleasure drive. We're not really behind that proposal. But anyway, I welcome your questions on this, and thank you for asking me to be on the panel.
All right, so there's a lot of interesting parallels or common themes that I'm seeing. Like Rochester, we have a system here. And there's also these sometimes competing ideals or ideas. Or I guess I'll rephrase that and say that sometimes the cohabitations of the current day park, sometimes they're more peaceful than others. And we can really see how the geography or where a park sits within the city can have huge impacts into the reception of a park, the maintenance of a park, the reinvestment in a park, and also the amount of outreach and engagement that are required to raise the visibility of a park. And historic designation is what? It's not necessarily one history that's highlighted, one history that's preserved. The natural history of any place likely was before the human history or the social history of that place. And so I'm seeing a theme here that histories overlap. And I really want to make sure that I have time to, or we all have time to weigh in or give some advice or information about historic designation for Washington Park. But before we get to that, I think that these common themes and these parallels and this idea of overlapping history, this makes me wonder, there's often concern with historic designation that it might limit the ability of people to do important things in the park. We talked about this with historic districts and what people can do in those districts. But I would say working with parks that have historic designation, how would you answer that, or how would you speak to that? Is historic designation a limitation on anything that could happen in the park? And would you urge public officials to embrace historic designation in contemporary American parks?
Absolutely. In our experience, the inventory and analysis that's required to achieve designation creates a clarity on, one of the one thing that's required is to decide on a period of significance. And the period of significance can span the Olmsted plan. In the case of Seneca Park, it included the non-Olmsted Zoo, and it designated certain buildings within the old zoo as historic. And so it's a very, it's a great process. Now, it didn't prevent the replacement of those old stinky buildings. They had to be disclosed as historic. There was a public process around it. It had people stop to think, is this the right thing to do? When the answer is yes, then it happens. So even the historic zoo buildings were replaced. And this pains me terrifically, but the historic designation actually expedited the latest zoo planning because it settled the issues. And so $40 million of state funds have gone to that damn zoo. And when, for decades, the county refrained from applying for any public funds to support the zoo because they didn't want to get into the historic impacts. They would have been required to disclose the historic impacts. They didn't want to do it, so they didn't apply for the funds. Once they did the work, all of a sudden they're eligible for all these funds. And it really pains me because it took us decades to raise $3 million to reconstruct the Children's Pavilion, which is so important to Seneca Park. So it's bogus. It doesn't prevent things that need to happen. It causes it involves a process of evaluation that is all good.
I would say yes, it's definitely worth it. Even though in our situation, the county and the representatives, lots of time, they have a hard time listening to us. And unless it comes to money, they're always looking at dollar signs. How is it going to make them money? And so, for instance, the county executive and the organization that they brought in to replace us were looking to put huge neon signs and an amusement water park or something like that inside the park. And so through conversations, private conversations with them, and we made them see how ridiculous that was. And also a little bit fib, like as if we had spoken to a whole bunch of community representatives, which we hadn't. We said, well, the community is completely against this. You can't have that. Because once we found out about it, it could have been too late, and we didn't have the time nor, the people power to go around and get a petition going, because it seemed as if it was something that they were going to do right away. And so sometimes you have to be really creative. Even though we knew that the people, the majority of the residents, would not support it. And so it is a lot of work, and I recommend that you get if they don't already have it, your Historic Preservation Commission to apply for a certified local government status. And that way they can apply for funds, and every municipality should have it, and work with the State Historic Preservation Office, and also the National Park Service will provide staff and technical assistance to help you through that process. And it is a lot of legwork going in front of the commissioners, or ours, they were called freeholders before, the Essex County Commissioners, who approved the budget, and then also, the city council to talk to them. about lending a hand. But again, it's who you know, it's dollar signs, and it's a lot of cronyism. And so you just have to be prepared and ready for a long fight. And come ready, have all your ducks lined up, pictures, bringing people from outside if you have to, and try to get the media involved. And so once word starts getting out, then they tend to sort of put it on hold and sometimes stop it.
Well, since Lake Park Friends has always operated with historic designations, it's not sort of something that we had to get used to and see, what were the advantages and disadvantages. It's always been sort of something that we're very proud of. I think that from the perspective of what it does to us, generally speaking, it's what JoAnn was talking about. It makes for very thoughtful decision making. You have to consider, when you're doing a project, you have to think about the historic implications of it, as well as the funding and all sorts of other things, environmental concerns, everything that goes into decision making. This is just one step, but I think a very valuable step in a park like this, which is truly, it's a jewel, it's a gift, it's something that we need to protect. And so I would say that the advantages have been primarily extremely positive. Of course, if there are advantages, they're extremely positive, but the outcomes have been extremely positive. If you read the ordinances very closely, and this came up recently, it can be taken too far. I think if you read the ordinances carefully, you could make an argument that every tree we planted would have to be run by the Historic Preservation Commission, because it is covered, it covers, the wording says covering plantings and nature in the parks. So this is because we're also under the city's North Point Historic District too. So far we haven't had to do that. And we hope we don't have to, but mostly it's been benefits.
When you mentioned ordinances, and there's this town in New Jersey, Westfield, and they had to review their historic preservation ordinance because even though they are a historic city, other developers, because there were loopholes. So the ordinance was old and it wasn't in compliance with the municipal land use law. So they bypassed that and they were able to destroy some historic buildings because of that.
I think as a landscape architect, I can see historic designations of parks and historic designations of architecture sort of differently. A park is like a living system. It's inherently dynamic, where a piece of architecture is less so, I'll say. So the idea of a period of significance in the life of a park, that's just an interesting thing to think about. With Lake Park, we see that the period of significance of this park and the designation encompassed a really long history. It was able to preserve something that's, hundreds of years before the design of this park was in existence. So that long timeline, I think, is really, really interesting in how we speak about what we're preserving. The other interesting idea that came up when I was thinking about the idea of Lake Park and Washington Park as being pieces of the system, and a part of the system being having historic designation and a layer of protection where another piece of our system does not. This idea that this process kind of settles issues maybe before they come up, and that it provides a period of evaluation, or I was thinking it sort of like a pause before any action. Not that that means that there is inaction, but that there is a pause before the action and a time to evaluate anything that's happening in the park. So Lake Park on the Historic Register, but Washington Park not. what would you say about engaging in this conversation or reopening the conversation about a designation for Washington Park, a designation for the system, and also understanding like the company that we're in New York, Boston, Rochester, like places that have really kind of looked at the parks as a system as a whole for designation?
Well, I'm pro designation. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, well, Sarah Cedar Miller said that Central Park was the most important work of art of the 19th century. This is a work of art. And if you found a Picasso in your attic, you wouldn't give it to your 10-year-old to make changes. You wouldn't, if you had a Frank Lloyd Wright building, you wouldn't go to Home Depot to replace a window. What is special and what is beautiful and what deserves to be preserved, that needs to be a really a deliberate process. Fortunately, the National Register gives us these national standards to use so that if you meet those standards, you have a nationally significant resource. And the great thing about this is there's the plan. Nobody has to guess. It's there in black and white. And in addition, there's all kinds of writing to refer to. Olmsted wrote down every thought he ever had, and fortunately, thanks to Charlie Beveridge, we have the and the Olmsted Network. We have access to the writings. This documentation is like gold. We should use it. That's what I would recommend for Washington Park.
Well, since I'm just learning really about Washington Park and Lake Park, I guess I'll agree with JoAnn. Yeah. And also to add that in terms of a park as a sanctuary, to look at that aspect in terms of mental health and physical health and the creativity that comes out of a park that can help residents. And you mentioned Patrick Sublime, right? Well, Weequahic Park, in terms of astonishing, right? In terms of sublime, some bodies, discovered in the park. So that tells you right then and there that there is a need, absolutely, for mental health and in terms of safety and physical health as well. And because people go there looking for beauty and they do not want to encounter that kind of astonishing view. Yeah.
I'm pro-preservation too, so I would. I certainly think that it could be a good idea for Washington Park, but Virginia. Before you seem to be moving away, Virginia knows Washington Park best, much better than I do, and she's a big supporter of historic preservation. So I just wonder if I could ask you to say whether you think that Washington Park should be pursuing historic designation, using the resources in the audience.
Let's see.
Well, I do think that there's value in historic designation, whether it's at the National Register level or the local level. There has been discussion at the local level, and it was proceeding, and then COVID happened. But I think there's a lot of misinformation about historic designation, and it's not just in Milwaukee. I experienced it in Sarasota, Florida, when I lived there, when no one had ever even heard of historic preservation until someone moved there from Boston. And then she helped restore a church, and people were like, and it was a beautiful, wooden church, and people were like, "You can do this?" And then people began to really take historic preservation seriously and valued it. And now Sarasota, Florida it has a wonderful tradition now of valuing its modernist legacies. It was a modernist mecca. No one knew that. I mean, a few people, some architects did. But as a result of a changing perception of the value of what is it that we have here that's valuable, I have just as much respect and appreciation for Washington Park as I do for Lake Park. I think that Riverside Park is more compromised in terms of the historic integrity of it over a long period of time, and it's a smaller park. It still has a lot of character, but I think if people don't understand what the purpose of historic designation is, they will not support it because it will just seem like just more of a hassle. And I think that we're missing the boat if we think that way.
So this is a topic that I think we could talk about for a really, really, really long time. It opens up a lot more questions maybe than it even answers sometimes. But it's really important, really, really important. We have these gems and we can understand, we know the picturesque or the pastoral and the things that make these places identifiable, recognizable, sort of the same, but then understanding how each one is so unique and of its place. And we can see almost as easily the differences between Washington Park, Riverside Park, and Lake Park as much as the sameness. And so I will open it to questions. You first.
I wanted to speak to the limitations of designation. It's how it can be useful and how it can disappoint, because it's not one and done, and there are different kinds of designations, and the power of politics and money to influence what happens in parks is profound. And I just wondered, in relation to those dynamics, which are always going on in parks, how does any kind of designation help you or frustrate you in its inability to do what you hope it may do? Either way.
The threats to the parks are incremental, and for the most part, I mean, we did have that one plan that was for expansion of the zoo in Seneca Park that was clearly inappropriate. But there are threats like every day. Can we put a temporary parking lot, temporary, mind you, in a picnic grove under 100-year-old oaks, and next year we'll remove it and you won't even know that it was there? This is the kind of incremental thing that comes up all the time. And in this one instance, saying, this is a National Register park, provided the one piece of information that's, okay, we'll do this in another place. This is not the best place for that incremental change. But there's no magic bullet to preservation. It's a slog. And there's no substitute for just being present and paying attention and speaking up when needed.
What was your question?
Yeah, this is as much a question as a comment. I'm from Chicago and Lake Geneva, and I've been dealing with National Register issues since about 1990, 1995. It's been my experience that if it's dealt with correctly, you can instill pride in the process, and you'll end up with a better result because people know what you've got, what the history is of a particular spot you're dealing with. And I believe I've had a lot of success. I don't do the nominations myself, I promote them. And I've got 2 cemeteries that way. And we're just exactly like I hoped. And I really encourage the National Registry process. And it is not really restrictive realistically. The one that's restrictive is national landmarking something. That makes it very hard to make changes. I don't worry about that in the registry process. Thanks.
In answer to your question, and I briefly mentioned how hard it is, and in terms of you have to have money and all the backroom deals. And a lot of them really don't know the law. A lot of these public officials who go into office, they really don't. And so we have to educate them. And last night I had, Millie and I, we had a conversation with Mr. Sen, who spoke yesterday. And we all agree that it comes down to education. And so you have to educate the public. You have to educate the public representatives because they really don't know a lot of times. And so it's arduous work. You just have to keep at it and make sure that they follow the letter of the law. You have to demand it. And you have to hold them accountable. As the same city councilwoman who put her body in front of the bulldozers when they were going to tear down the stadium, she told me one time, you have to hold us accountable. And I never forgot that. And, to their chagrin, I do hold them accountable.
Does historical designation trump state mandates? We have some big problems in California with ADUs. My city is an Olmsted city, and we have CCNRs that are supposed to protect the way the city is developed. And the state mandates are allowing structures to be built and land to be rezoned without being reviewed by this entity that Olmsted created. And so I don't know if there's a way to protect our CCNRs rather than protecting a particular building or a particular park.
Can you repeat the question?
Essentially, the question was if we have state mandates here in Wisconsin that trump a national designation. I mean, there's definitely a hierarchy to these things. I'm not an expert on state mandates or how SHPO works in conjunction with historic. Virginia knows.
In short, the State Historic Preservation Office is charged with helping to follow the guidelines on behalf of the National Register. The National Register designates the state, SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, to do the oversight. And they work closely together, if that makes sense. There's not, I don't know as much about the state designation, except that at that state level, they will recommend something for the National Register. They will support it, they will help do the research often. So there's a working together. There is not usually a tension between them that I know of. Unless the state doesn't want to do its role, but every state does have a state historic preservation office.
I think that we have to end this conversation, sadly, for lunch, but I think we could keep it going informally, right?
Absolutely. No, I want to say thank you to all of you. It's been a very provocative conversation. And in a way, it helps me lead into the rest of the day and our conference. I mean, you all have really talked about preservation is a slog. What you all are doing as friends groups is a slog. It's tough. It's hard. That's why the Olmsted Network exists. We are here as a national organization to help friends groups around the country. We are the only national organization that cares about Olmsted landscape specifically. And so all of you have talked about the need for advocacy, the need for education, the need for stewardship. And those are the things that we do. And I think as I heard you, when we think about advocacy, so Ravine Bridge, which Anne referred to, we'll see it. there was a big fight on whether or not to basically replace it with something new or to retain the historic bridge. A member of our board came and testified, spoke to the media, and was very engaged in that process. And we are happy to say it was a successful process. Wynnie-Fred talked about various issues with the Essex County Executive and the county executives in and around Newark. We have had experience with them. They consistently want to go in and develop. So the Olmsted Network was engaged in advocacy. We wrote comments in opposition to development, expansion of a zoo within the South Mountain Reservation, not part of Weequahic, but part of another system. So we were there to argue against that from a national perspective. Similarly, Olmsted Beale House, we'll hear a little bit more about them tonight. We led the charge for getting the Olmsted Beale Farmhouse on the state and national historic designation. And what we are able to do as a network is enlist a larger group of Olmsted family members to support you. So when Olmsted Beale was looking for protection, we were able to call in people from other places around the country. We were able to call in national organizations such as the American Society of Landscape Architects and the City Parks Alliance to help in that cause. And so as I think, when we think about the Washington Park designation, I will say here, we want to see Washington Park be designated, and we will be there to help the local Friends group as they move forward in doing so. And then education, I wanted to talk about that just briefly. We heard a lot about parks as spaces for free speech. I think the Pokemon was a wonderful example. We heard yesterday about protests for Black Lives Matter. These also are important aspects of Olmsted Parks. And so in the latter part of October, we will be sponsoring a webinar that looks at free speech in Olmsted Parks. And we will be having a protester from Louisville will be speaking to us, a professor from Harvard who will be talking about Olmsted and space and how he viewed it in the Civil War. And so these are the kinds of things that we do as a network to educate the public, to educate and help on advocacy, and ultimately to help with stewardship. We are still finalizing this, but we are preparing to create an impact fund so that we will also be able to supply funding for nascent Friends groups and others who are in need of support as they get going. So I'm glad that this panel raised all of these issues because these, in fact, are the key components of protecting and preserving these remarkable spaces, these beautiful pieces of art, these critical infrastructure, these ecologically necessary places. We're here to help you. And as a national organization, we can bring a national voice to efforts at the ground level. So again, I want to thank everyone for a wonderful conversation, and we will have our lunch now. So thank you.